Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started with the next session. We have a large group to get to on this session, some 7 panelists in a little over an hour. My name is John Truzzolino. I'm the Director of Business Development at Donnelly Financial Solutions. We go by DFIN. We're a global risk and compliance solutions provider. Some of you in the room may use our products for the reporting, collaboration, and tagging of your documents today. I want to build off of Karina's discussion just before we left for the break. Early today, we talked about people don't understand the Financial Transparency Act, where it came from. And she talked about it started in 2014. It actually started before that. There was a bill introduced under an iteration called the Madoff Act. And I start with that because you don't always get it right the first time. Imagine a bill on transparency being referenced by Madoff. It was make all documents open for financial transparency. So anyway, I start here because we're talking about the timeline. And on today's panel, I want to introduce our panelists because they're going to give us some insight into the rulemaking process and the timeline involved with that for implementation of the FDIC, specifically as it relates to Section 5823 of the Financial Transparency Act. And in our discussion today, each one of the speakers will kind of showcase how their organizations are playing a key role in the implementation of the Financial Transparency Act. I'll go quickly through introductions. Liz Sweeney is president and founder of Nutshell Associates, a public finance and consulting agency focused on consulting with municipal advisory services. Liz has extensive experience with credit analysis, disclosure, rating agency relations, municipal debt products, and structured data. So she brings a unique perspective to our panel today. Dave Sanchez is director of the Office of Municipal Securities at the SEC. Dave has almost 30 years experience in all aspects of municipal finance market. In prior service at the SEC, Dave was the principal drafter of the final municipal advisor rule and the 2012 commission report on the state of municipal securities. And we have Joel Black, chair of the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB. Joel was named in that position in July 2020 and came to GASB with over 16 years experience in the firm's practice and focusing on exclusively with state and local government reporting. So with that, I'd like to go right into the questions for Liz. I think we'll lead with you and Dave from the MSRB's perspective. Can you give us some insight into the timeline in the rulemaking process and showcase what that means for your agency and how your agency will be involved?
Sure. Can anyone hear me? The timeline is, so FDTA is broken into 2 pieces, and really for munis there'll actually be 3 pieces. But the first is a multi-agency rulemaking, which will establish data standards and also establish a legal entity identifier. And under the statute, that's a 2-year time period from when the statute was passed, which means that proposed rules are expected if the timeline under the statute is followed next summer. And then those would be finalized late 2024. And then once those are done, then there's a specific section related to munis, which is 5823, which has an additional 2-year timeline to establish the rules related specifically to munis. And kind of interestingly, right, there's one whole section for the rest of the SEC, and then a separate section specifically for munis, which is actually really helpful. And then once that's done, really, and this is where I'll kick it over to Liz, but there will be additional work that will need to be done because we're writing the data standards that apply to information submitted to the MSRB. And so there's going to need to be things done at the MSRB level, depending on what ends up in that 5823.
Great, thank you. And so today I'm wearing my MSRB board member hat in this discussion, and all the usual disclaimers about my opinions are my own apply today as well. So just for, as Dave said, just for very quick background, the FDTA asks the SEC to write the rules with respect to implementation of the FDTA for the muni market. The MSRB has a rule book of its own and also runs the transparency systems that power the market. So just for very quick background, the MSRB was created by Act of Congress in 1970 to be the principal regulator for the municipal securities market. And they gave us the authority to regulate the broker-dealers, the banks who underwrite and trade municipal securities. And then under Dodd-Frank, they gave us the additional authority to regulate municipal advisors who advise municipalities on the issuance of municipal securities. So we have a rule book of over 40 rules that address things like the professional qualifications of securities market professionals, the record keeping, the fair dealing of traders and underwriters, the fiduciary duties of municipal advisors, transparency around political contributions reporting, and the like. We also have rules that govern our information facilities, or IF rules. There are 3 of them, which reflect the use of our 3 major information facilities. And the one you may be the most familiar with is EMMA, which is where you can find primary and secondary market disclosures about municipal securities.
Well, can I just interject there? And I mean, so it's also important to remember, right? So yes, MSRB does regulate broker-dealers and municipal advisors. The fact that EMMA is the repository for disclosure documents is a function of an SEC rule. So the SEC passed a rule which designated MSRB as the repository. So that is not something that comes from Congress to the MSRB. That's something that comes from the SEC to the MSRB.
Thank you. So the SEC designated the MSRB as the sole repository of certain municipal securities market data. And so as we think about implementing the FDTA and the contours of the rules coming out of the SEC become clearer, I would anticipate we at the MSRB will do a top to bottom review of our rule book to make sure that it can accommodate and certainly not impede the implementation of the FDTA. For example, if a rule contains the responsibility to file a form and the rule talks about the contents of the form or the file format, and those things change under implementation of FDTA, clearly the rule needs to be updated. So I think the general behavioral characteristics and expectations that are built into the rules about how professionals should act in the business, I don't think is really going to be the core of the FDTA, but we obviously will have some, rulemaking needs that will fall out of, the rules that the SEC will be working on over the next couple of years.
Right, because importantly, the FDTA, for example, on disclosure, there's no new disclosure requirements, standards, timelines, whatever. It's just about structured data, and yeah. So similarly, with respect to like behavior rules of municipal advisors, broker dealers, you wouldn't expect any change on that front either.
That was helpful. I think this one will start with Joel. What's the role of your organization? And we'll go back to Liz and Dave too, but what's the role of your organization in the municipal securities market? And specifically, how do you see your organization participating in the implementation of the FDTA?
Thanks, John. And thanks to XBRL US for having us. It's really awesome to be a part of such a distinguished panel. And I should make the same disclaimer like Liz. These are just my views. The board has to have a majority of its members, one of which is over here, but we don't have enough of us here to make decisions. So I don't speak for the whole board, nor am I certainly making any decisions here, but these are my views. So in answering your question, John, what's our role in the muni market? I don't presume, we've been referenced a few times already today, but I don't presume that everybody in the room knows who we are or what we do, but we are an unbiased, independent nonprofit that our mission is to establish accounting and financial reporting standards for state and local governments in the United States. And those standards are recognized as generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, because we have a very robust due process that we go through, getting input from everybody through public comment, through outreach, for those who prepare that information, those who use that information, those who audit that information, bringing all those perspectives to bear as we add to or change rules that we make. That's why our standards are considered to be generally accepted. And so that's our role in the market. How we play a role, I guess, in FDTA, I'd like to step back a little bit and talk about my interest in electronic financial reporting. I came to the GASB about 3 or a little over 3 years ago, and we have, as a government community, provided financial reports in much the same way for decades, right? It used to be a big paper document. Now it's a big electronic paper document issued a number of years after year end. I had to imagine, or I at least was interested in understanding how that process was evolving, and in particular, how technology was changing that process. And so it took a little bit of time, but about 18 months or so ago, I was able to devote some of our staff resources to doing research and outreach and understanding how that process was changing. We had about 2 FTEs spread among 4 people, one of whom, Becca Kaiser, is here today, that have worked on that. And they started that process, that research, with outreach to tech firms, to financial statement users, investors, to figure out how were they ingesting information that comes out of governments into their decision-making processes. And what we found for a while was still a lot of manual input, right? We still have this PDF and people manually extract it and input it into their systems. But we did start to, especially as you talk to the tech firms, start seeing that was changing, that there were technologies available and being utilized in the market that scrape data out of a PDF prepared by the government in the same way that it always has prepared PDFs, extracts something like 30,000 data points, right, that they picked out, and quote unquote normalizes that data and spits it out to subscribers so that a subscriber can compare government A to government B, can in fact then look at that normalized data, actually look at where it came from that actual PDF, could even pull up the PDF of the government's report to see it. So it was evolving, right? It was changing. But as you think about that, if you think about our mission of those accounting and financial reporting standards, what we're really trying to do in achieving that mission is make sure that the users of government external financial reports are getting the information they need to make decisions and assess a government's accountability. And if you think about how that new electronic way of reporting was evolving or is starting to evolve, somebody else is kind of making those decisions, right? If you look in the future and you say, well, users might at some point say, look, this electronic information is much easier for me to ingest into my processes, my analysis, my systems. I'm going to use that's easier for me to get, but somebody else has picked those points, those 30,000 points, or maybe something less, of maybe these 2 notes to the financial statements are really the important ones. That's what I'm going to make available electronically, or these 50 items from the financial statements are the right data points that I'm going to make available. Somebody else is kind of making that choice. We happen to think everything in the financial report is important to users. That's why we require it as part of GAAP. And so we hope to be and would like to be involved in the process of establishing whatever this rule is, whatever this financial statement taxonomy is, because we think that helps achieve our mission. We think that would be helpful to those in the marketplace who are used to GAAP already. They won't have to learn theoretically something new. So that was all happening. FDTA kind of came out in the middle of that. If anything, to me, this speeds up what was happening inevitably. I think it was coming anyway. So we are starting to work on that. We are those 4 FTEs. We're actually adding 1 new position that we're interviewing for now. That's a taxonomy specialist to add to that group. Are now transitioning from research, although we'll continue that too, to development of a financial statement taxonomy. It's a long process. It will take more than probably those 3 FTEs to get that done in any reasonable time. But our idea in doing that is just to start the process. We think we are in a good position to be able to do that. But ultimately, as it relates specifically to FDTA, that will be the SEC that makes that decision I think first they have to decide, even if the financial statements are part of the covered information that needs to be made machine readable, that's not necessarily a given, right, that would be the case. But even if they do that, then they can decide who they want to develop an FDTA taxonomy. I don't know if they want to keep that themselves, assign it to somebody else, or interact with us in the way the SEC does with the FASB. We'd certainly be open to that. But at least we've started that process. If they choose not to do financial statements, we're going to continue on because, again, I think this is inevitable anyway. So we will continue on with the taxonomy. If they actually happen to want to work with us, then we've at least started, right? And if they want to do it with somebody else, then we've got something we can use to provide to others to help everybody in the process and in our community.
Thank you, Joel. Liz, can you give your perspective from
Sure.
where you're sitting?
Yeah, sure. So, with respect to the MSRB's role in the implementation of the FDTA, I talked about our rule book. Just talk about technology for a minute. As we mentioned, the MSRB runs the major transparency systems that power the market. And we're already used to collecting a lot of information in a lot of different formats. There's a lot of attention given to the PDFs that are collected. And that is true. There's a lot of PDFs collected, but we also collect a lot of information in other formats, including structured data. We collect every trade, every fixed rate trade in the munis has to be reported through an MSRB system, and that's already structured data. So we're already used to collecting a lot of different data in a lot of different formats. So we're not expecting that, the kinds of data standards that, and not to speculate about what they might be, but the kinds of data standards that might be adopted for the muni market are unlikely to be, so new or bespoke that we would have any, significant challenges with updating our systems in order to accommodate it. And again, not to minimize the work of the MSRB's technology staff either, but the MSRB in our budget and in our staffing, we are more than half technology. It's not so much lawyers who write regulations, but very much we're a technology company as well. The other thing I want to mention is we have a data modernization effort that I think is going to be very helpful for implementation of the FDTA. And this is something we were doing anyway. For example, creating a unified database of all the issuers and a database of all the obligors in the muni market, which is much harder than it sounds. There are, as you probably know, roughly 40,000 issuers. We've collected the names of issuers over decades in unstructured ways. And you can imagine that those who've uploaded information about, their latest bond issue may have typed the names quite differently or used different acronyms, abbreviations. I mean, everybody in the muni market who does, research knows exactly what I'm talking about. So having a unified database that says, nope, all these 14 iterations of the same entity is one entity, and unifying that is really important, because then you want to layer structured data on top of it. It's great to have just one entity that you're pointing to the right entity. So we'd be doing that work anyway, but that's one thing we think is going to be really helpful with implementation of the FDTA.
Thanks, Dave.
Sure, I feel like I got two pitches there a little bit, but so I'm gonna also get in on the disclaimer party, because usually I'm the only one that has to make a disclaimer, but now everyone's done it, so I should also. But clearly, the views I express here today are my own and don't reflect the views of the commission or anyone else on the commission staff. And so our job is to write the rule. So we got that job, and so I think importantly, in that process, built into the rule is several things that have to be considered. So first of all, whatever the multi-agency rulemaking does with respect to data standards and legal entity identifier, I mean, the idea there is you pretty much have to follow it. However, built into the rule is we have to consider whether things are practicable. We have to consider whether things are feasible. We are allowed to do scalability depending on individual needs of issuers or any other market participant. And we also have to avoid disruption in the market. So all those things are really important. I mean, the one thing that everyone has to realize is, and it's said all the time, but it's extremely true, is there are a lot of different issuers in a lot of different positions, and we have to be very conscious of what's realistic, what's actually gonna move us forward, not just kind of impose this totally aspirational product on folks. So all those things are things that we consider, and so it's always useful to us to hear what is being done, what is being accomplished in various contexts, because then that helps to inform what is actually going to be reasonable or practicable. And so, but during this process, and for us, it's that initial 4-year process, like we have to weigh all of those things, and we intend to weigh all of those things very seriously. It's great when you have individual examples, but you always have to weigh whether that example really can be scalable to the entire very, very diverse market. And to one thing Liz said earlier, another thing to remember that folks have to remember is everybody's paid a lot of attention to just the disclosure aspect of it and what does this mean to issuers. But there's a lot of information submitted to the MSRB. Most of it is not from issuers. Most of it is from regulated entities. And so a lot of attention and a lot of what comes out of the FDTA will be on that information as well. And so I think it's important that folks not lose sight of it, because that's a big part of the process as well.
Thank you. So we covered the timeline for the rulemaking. We talked about the rulemaking process. We talked about your respective participation. Tell us now about the stakeholders involved in each one of your domains and some of the challenges that we face and how we can address the pros and cons moving forward. This time I think we'll start with Dave.
Sure. I think our stakeholders are everybody. It would take me forever to list all the names of folks we've already talked to, folks who have reached out, but obviously there's a lot of major muni market participants. Also happy to hear from anybody else, who thinks they have a good idea about how this should work. So I'm not joking, we really look at the stakeholders as being very broad, and we also really encourage people to come in and talk. Even starting now, we've had a lot of conversations with various stakeholders that have really appreciated the input, and will continue to have that. But I will really emphasize that when the multi-agency rulemaking proposal comes out, which again is expected next summer, and that's the first time that we'll have a sense of what might be in play for the muni market, that's going to be where it's really important to hear from everybody, both in official comment letters to that multi-agency rulemaking, but also fine to reach out to us directly at OMS to say, hey, this looks good, or, I foresee these kind of problems, whatever. Again, we're hearing from a lot of folks already about trying to anticipate what would work for the muni market and what wouldn't. But when that multi-agency rulemaking comes out, that's when everybody will have the first sense of what's really at play. And that's where it's going to be really crucial to hear from folks as to what they think might be the good or bad impacts on the muni market from those proposed data standards.
And just to follow on there, so the SEC has a well-established process for delivering rules and proposal state commenting period.
Absolutely, and so that will be part of that process, right? There will be a multi-agency rulemaking, but it will have a comment period like every other rule we do has a comment period, and so of course the official comments are very important. But as a supplement to that, if you look at any comment file for a SEC rule, it'll also talk about meetings. And sometimes those can be helpful or a supplement or whatever to the official comment file. So we're going to be very happy to be hearing from folks once that proposal comes out to see, hey, this is how we think this is going to affect the muni market. These are the problems we foresee. These are the problems we don't foresee. Because once that gets locked into place, then that's our parameters that we have to work with when we get to the muni specific rule. So we definitely want folks to highlight any problems they might see with that multi-agency rulemaking.
Thank you. And just working with Michelle on the commenting process on various rules, it's exciting to see the work that goes into that, where you take the time to review the rule, put it to paper, and work with the group to write your comments. And we know the SEC reads the comments because there are clear references in the final rule to the comments that are, making those changes worth the while.
I mean,
So-
that's the one thing I'll say. I mean, every comment is definitely taken extremely seriously. I mean, it actually is amusing to me when I see press and kind of the context of other rules saying they don't feel. I mean, that is to a fault. All comments, all concerns, meetings and paper, whatever, those are all taken very seriously and considered. So definitely take the time to do it.
Thank you. Liz, from your view?
Yeah, not a lot additional to add. And MSRB has a mission to protect issuers, protect investors, uphold the public trust. That means our stakeholders are broad. It's everybody in Muni land, as we affectionately call it. So it's really, again, very broad stakeholders, and we do a lot, very extensive outreach with all stakeholders. And similar to the SEC process, there's almost always a public request for comment process. I can tell you for sure, every comment gets read and discussed. So pretty similar.
Joel?
So I don't want to say the same thing, given that our stakeholders are kind of everybody. I've already talked about that a little bit, but I thought I might address a few challenges or things that I've heard as people talk about FDTA, because I've been on a number of these panels at a number of conferences around the country for the past 6 months or so. And I might choose a little bit self-serving ones because using GAAP is part of the answer. But one of the things that you often heard, especially early on with FDTA, was that the muni market is different. We have all these different segments. We have, public health agencies and colleges and universities and public utilities, and then cities and counties and states, and they're all different, right? And are we going to create taxonomies for each of these separately? And that sounds like a lot to do. Well, if you really step back and think about financial reporting, there's only one GAAP that all of those agencies use, and I'm going to get to the non-GAAP people in a minute. I'm going to forget about them. But predominantly, those entities all use one GAAP, and we don't have a separate GAAP for colleges and universities or healthcare entities or states is different from towns or school districts. It's all one GAAP. And so I think that a taxonomy for at least entities that will report with GAAP is doable in one taxonomy. We don't need separate ones for all those segments. And I say that partly because there are alternatives to GAAP. There are options you can pick, but we are able to build those into a taxonomy. Earlier today, somebody talked about a financial statement taxonomy like a tree, and that's actually a lot how we have thought about it as we're in the initial stages of structuring our taxonomy. It starts with the reporting entity as a whole, and then you think about all these different branches, right? And I feel a little bit like I'm talking to a lot of XBRL people who are like, duh, Joel, like what? We all know this stuff. But anyway, for those in the room who may not be XBRL specialists, whatever, there's all these branches, right? And then each statement, and then within each statement, you have all these alternatives. And at some point, the tree goes out enough that it's GAAP compliant, and these are GAAP requirements. And then we add into a taxonomy things that might be called practical considerations. And these are things that aren't necessarily required by GAAP, but based on research and what we see in the marketplace, you're able to say, well, healthcare entities kind of need these different accounts. And we can add those in as parts of the rule that address those practical considerations. So I think there are ways to create one taxonomy that deals with all the segments.
And fine, but so I mean, obviously we have like a little bit of template for what's happened in the corporate market, which everybody sees was a much more simple process, and even as part of that process, one of the complaints is there are a lot of custom tags. In fact, so many custom tags that it might not be as useful as people think. So, I mean, I know you've looked at that kind of stuff, and how do you think you can address that, given that again we are talking about a much more complex with way more branches.
Yeah, it has more branches. It is more complex, but I think the corporate sector is probably not given it enough deference. That is complexity, right? An oil and gas entity is different than a media company, is different from a real estate company. But we do have more complexities, more funds and things like that, and different bases of accounting. But I think that I guess I won't speak to whether you will have the ability to have customizable tags. That's probably a decision for later. But I think that even what you see in the FASB version of XBRL is that they are continuously improving the taxonomy to add tags. And I think the SEC is, addressing, and we even heard it earlier today, people that use customizable tags when they investigate it, doesn't look like they should be using a customizable tag. So I think that market is kind of maybe not as wild west as it maybe initially was with the customizable tags, but I'm hopeful that we can.
So my point is, but this has been a 15-year process, right? With something that is a requirement, so.
Time. I'm not saying it'll be done in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It will take time, right?
Okay.
But yes, but part of, I think in a way we're more complicated. So in a way it's going to take more time, but in a way we've learned from a lot of the paths that have been forged on the public company side that we can learn from and be more efficient in development of that. I want to address one more thing, and that's the non-GAAP filers, right? And so we do know that there are non-GAAP filers. I don't think it's a huge part of the market. We're actually trying to do some research to get our arms around what does that look like, and within those non-GAAP filers, number one, how big of an issue is it? And number two, what's the difference between each of those? Because New Jersey governments and what they report on is different than maybe a Kansas government that doesn't follow GAAP and follows some kind of Kansas regulatory accounting. But how different are there? And is there some type of either alternative taxonomy or use of the existing GAAP taxonomy to expand using practical considerations or some kind of identifiers that identify a non-GAAP and is generic enough to encompass all of those non-GAPs, as opposed to having to have New Jersey taxonomy and Kansas non-GAAP taxonomy or whatever all those others will be. But it was something we're trying to get our arms around the issue and maybe provide information to the SEC and the marketplace about the size of that issue, and then think about how we address that in the taxonomy. But I think it's workable without creating 100 different taxonomies.
Well, what's great is that you're actually digging in and doing that work, because obviously a lot of the early conversation is just like, oh, we don't know. But you know what I mean? Like, this seems like it might be a problem. But, it's obviously really helpful and really appreciated that you guys are digging in so clearly to identify maybe this is a problem. And then even though everyone thought this was a problem, it's actually not a problem now that we looked at it more closely. So that part has been really helpful and really appreciated.
So the last question, there are a few unknowns. We don't know the standards. We don't know what format. Can you help us, I'll ask each of you to give your opinion there, on what we can do now to set the table. We know the clock is ticking, and we're moving forward. Are there things that we should be doing now to help make this implementation a more streamlined approach when we do know the standards and we do know the machine readable formats?
Well, so one thing that's interesting is just something like a good example is what Joel mentioned of, we know there are a number of non-GAAP accounting states, et cetera, but then to figure out exactly what portion of those are actually issuers, is something that's actually useful to do. So, a lot of the messaging for us has been, hey, wait until we figure out what the standards are, because unfortunately a lot of people were being scared into spending money and kind of taking these steps that were way too soon. And I was also encouraged to hear the MSRB saying, they're not making any big steps because, again, they don't know the standards either of what's going to apply. And I think that's prudent, especially since, their fees are paid by other people. So, people are always sensitive to that. But that said, I think there are some areas even before we see the standards approved, for example, how much is non-GAAP, that folks are aware of, that folks can think about it and give us some idea, and that's helpful as early as we hear it. But But a lot of it is gonna have to wait a couple of months until we at least know the proposed standards, and then that gives like a lot of meat to deal with.
No, exactly. And just to take it to like a higher level, the law applies to information collected by the MSRB.
Submitted.
Now, information submitted to the MSRB, and the GASB Act gets a lot of attention, and rightly so, right? And we're focused today on local governments. The muni market has thousands of nonprofit issuers, hospitals, charter schools, universities, right? It's a very large, heterogeneous market. And so you really want to think about that breadth of information submitted to the MSRB, not just, ACFRs, but political contributions reporting, regulatory registration forms. We collect quarterly unaudited financial statements, budgets, demand statistics, material event reporting. It's a large list of things. So, the FCC has this task of figuring out which of those things really needs to be machine readable. How do we think about that breadth of things and start to make decisions about like what's the most important stuff? And even within stuff, like take an official statement, which is 400 pages long, often you're not going to make every piece of it machine readable, right? And so there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. But I like to think about the breadth of everything that's submitted and think about, well, what's the framework for considering how to think about what, how to prioritize, right? Which of those things should be in this new machine readable format. And then even within that, how would we make decisions around what portions of, right? And so I just wanted to just take the conversation up to a higher level for a moment to remind everybody about the breadth of what we're talking about. This is a big lift. And whether it's a GASB ACFR or FASB ACFR, that's still just a small, it's still just a small piece of the picture.
Thanks, Liz and Joel.
Sure. I guess I would think about it, what can we do starting now moving forward as well as afterward? And I think that others have talked about collaboration and talked about this community, this XBRL community that exists. And it doesn't have to be XBRL community, but if you think about our muni finance, public finance, government financial reporting community, I think we all need to be contributing to Dave and their information. Getting together in forums like this one, where all of you are in the room and different representatives, whether it's issuers or investors or data tech people or even auditors, getting those people in the room with their different perspectives on challenges that might be faced and things that need to be thought about as we work through the rules. And then once the rules are out, how do we address those rules? How do we meet those challenges? How do we effectively implement this in a way that makes a lot of sense and help each other? And I think that when you get in rooms and you hear from all those different perspectives, we certainly understand that at the GASB. We have an advisory council that we meet with at least 3 times a year, 30 different people, but it's a balanced group of users, preparers, and auditors. And even those people, when they're in the room and start hearing from the other perspectives, you might think you understand the other perspectives, but when you hear it from them, you have a better appreciation for what their concerns are. And then maybe you can morph your views to try to minimize some of the risks or challenges that they might be facing to get to a better kind of collaborated, position that works for everybody. I think we need to try to work on that from now, really moving forward.
I just have one more quick thing, building off what Liz said, because it was a really good point, which is, there is all this information submitted to the MSRB. When you break down, I've seen some conversation both with us, but also in the public about, okay, let's break down the financial statements. What portions of the financial statements do we really need to see? What portions of an official statement, are the most high priority for us to see in structured data, other types of information. But that's something that can be done now. And I've, obviously seen some of that discussion, like different perspectives on what portions of financial statements should be subject to this. So all that stuff is stuff that could be done now and discussed with us, and it's really helpful to hear.
I want to thank our panel for an engaging conversation and our audience. We're getting ready for the next panel. We have 4 more speakers coming up, but I do thank you for your time and the discussion.